Ellen Gould White was a prolific author and an American Christian pioneer. Along with other Sabbatarian Adventist leaders such as Joseph Bates and her husband James White, she formed what became known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Smithsonian magazine named Ellen G.White among 100 most significant Americans in an acknowledgement of her influence on religion. Ellen White reported her visionary experiences to her fellow believers. James White and others of the Adventist pioneers viewed these experiences as the biblical gift of prophecy as outlined in Revelation chapter 12 verse 17 and Revelation chapter 19 verse 10, which describe the testimony of Jesus as the spirit of prophecy. Her Conflict of the Ages series of writings endeavor to showcase the hand of God in biblical history and in church history. This cosmic conflict, referred to by Seventh-day Adventist theologians as the Great Controversy theme, became foundational to the development of Seventh-day Adventist theology. Her book on successful Christian living, Steps to Christ, has been published in more than 140 languages. White was considered a somewhat controversial figure by her critics, with much of the controversy centering on her reports of visionary experiences and on the use of other sources in her writings. She experienced her first vision soon after the Millerite Great Disappointment of 1844. Historian Randall Balmer has described White as one of the more important and colorful figures in the history of American religion. Walter Martin described her as one of the most fascinating and controversial personages ever to appear upon the horizon of religious history. Arthur L. White, her grandson and biographer, writes that Ellen G. White is the most translated female non-fiction author in the history of literature, as well as the most translated American non-fiction author of either gender. Her writings covered a broad range of subjects, including religion, social relationships, prophecy, publishing, nutrition, creationism, agriculture, theology, evangelism, Christian lifestyle, education and health. She advocated vegetarianism. She promoted and was instrumental in the establishment of schools and medical centers. During her lifetime she wrote more than 5,000 periodical articles and 40 books. As of 2015, more than 100 White titles are available in English, including compilations from her 100,000 pages of manuscript. Some of her most famous books she wrote include The Desire of Ages, The Great Controversy and Steps to Christ. Her work on successful Christian living, Steps to Christ, has been published in more than 140 languages. Personal life. Early life. Ellen and her twin sister Elizabeth were born November 26, 1827, to Robert and Eunice Harmon. Robert was a farmer who also made hats using mercuric nitrate. Much of Ellen's youth was spent in the business pursuit of her father's hat-making business. Ellen learned the simplest part of it, which was shaping the crown of the hat. Ancestry. In 1999, Charles E. Dudley, Sr., published a book entitled The Genealogy of Ellen Gould Harmon White, the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the story of the growth and development of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination as it relates to African Americans. In his book, Charles Dudley claims that Ellen White had an African American ancestry. In March 2000, the Ellen G. White estate commissioned Roger D. Joslin, a professional genealogist, to research Ellen G. White's ancestry. Joslin concluded that she was of Anglo-Saxon origin. Joslin found that Ellen's mother, Eunice Harmon, was the daughter of Joseph Gould, an American Revolutionary soldier. After the war, he moved from Kittery to Portland, Maine. His father was Joseph Gould of Kittery. His father, Ellen's great-grandfather, was also named Joseph Gould. He settled in Kittery in the first decade of the 1700s and was probably from Taunton, Massachusetts. His father was John Gould of Taunton and probably the one born in Hingham, Massachusetts Bay Colony, son of Jarvis Gould, a 1635 immigrant from England. See her ancestral chart. Head injury. At the age of 9, while running towards home with her sister Elizabeth and another friend, an older classmate shouted some angry words and threw a stone that hit Ellen on the face. White would later write of her conversion experience that happened a few years after the incident. This misfortune, which for a time seemed so bitter and was so hard to bear, has proved to be a blessing in disguise. A cruel blow which blighted the joys of earth was the means of turning my eyes to heaven. I might never had known Jesus Christ, had not the sorrow that clouded my early years led me to seek comfort in him. Quote, she felt that she might be dying, and believing she was about to die, the 9-year-old Ellen in simple faith confessed her sins. A few years after her injury, Ellen, with her parents, attended a Methodist camp meeting at Buxton, Maine, and there, at the age of 12, a breakthrough occurred in which she had a conversion experience and felt at peace. Millerite movement. In 1840, at age 12, her family became involved with the Millerite movement. As she attended William Miller's lectures, Ellen felt guilty for her sins, and she was filled with terror about being eternally lost. She describes herself as spending nights in tears and prayer, and being in this condition for several months. On June 26, 1842, she was baptized by John Hobart in Casco Bay in Portland, Maine, and eagerly awaited Jesus to come again. In her later years, she referred to this as the happiest time of her life. Her family's involvement with Millerism caused them to be disfellowshipped by the local Methodist Church. Marriage and family. Sometime in 1845, Ellen came into contact with her future husband, James Springer White, a Millerite who became convinced that her visions were genuine. A year later, James proposed and they were married by a justice of the peace in Portland, Maine, on August 30, 1846. James later wrote, "We were married August 30, 1846, and from that hour to the present she has been my crown of rejoicing. It has been in the good providence of God that both of us had enjoyed a deep experience in the Advent movement. This experience was now needed as we should join our forces and, united, labor extensively from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. James and Ellen had 4 sons, Henry Nichols, James Edson, William Clarence, and John Herbert. Only Edson and William lived to adulthood. John Herbert died of erysipelas at the age of 3 months, and Henry died of pneumonia at the age of 16 in 1863. Final years and death. Ellen White spent the final years of her life in Elms Haven, her home in St. Helena, California, after the death of her husband James White in 1881. During her final years she would travel less frequently as she concentrated upon writing her last works for the church. Ellen G.White died July 16, 1915, at her home in Elms Haven, which is now an Adventist historical site. After 3 funerals, she is buried with her husband James White in Oak Hill Cemetery, Battle Creek, Michigan. Ministry. Visions from 1844 to 1863. White experienced between 100 and 200 visions, typically in public places and meeting halls. She had one that led to the writing of the Great Controversy at an Ohio funeral service held on a Sunday afternoon in March 1858. In the Lovett's Grove Public School, a vision of the ages-long conflict between Christ and his angels and Satan and his angels was given to Mrs. White. In later life, the visions occurred at home during the night. From the time she was 17 years old until she died 70 years later. later, she had approximately 2,000 visions and dreams. The visions varied in length from less than a minute to nearly 4 hours. The knowledge and counsel received through these revelations are reflected in the books and many articles she wrote. Physical phenomena during visions. J.N. Loughborough, who had seen White in vision 50 times since 1852, and her husband, James White, listed several physical characteristics that marked the visions. In passing into vision, she gives 3 enrapturing shouts of glory, which echo and re-echo, the second, and especially the third, fainter but more thrilling than the first, the voice resembling that of one quite a distance from you, and just going out of hearing. For a few seconds she would swoon, having no strength. Then she would be instantly filled with superhuman strength, sometimes rising to her feet and walking about the room. She frequently moved hands, arms, and head in gestures that were free and graceful, but to whatever position she moved a hand or arm, it could not be hindered nor controlled by even the strongest person. In 1845, she held her parents' 18.5-pound family Bible in her outstretched left hand for half an hour. She weighed 80 pounds at the time. She did not breathe during the entire period of a vision that ranged from 15 minutes to 3 hours. Yet, her pulse beat regularly and her countenance remained pleasant as in the natural state. Her eyes were always open without blinking, her head was raised, looking upward with a pleasant expression as if staring intently at some distant object. Several physicians, at different times, conducted tests to check her lack of breathing and other physical phenomena. She was utterly unconscious of everything transpiring around her and viewed herself as removed from this world, and in the presence of heavenly beings. When she came out of vision, all seemed total darkness, whether in the daytime or a well-lighted room at night. She would exclaim with a long-drawn sigh as she took her first natural breath, "Dark." She was then limp and strengthless. Mrs. Martha Amadorn added, "There was never an excitement among those present during a vision. Nothing caused fear. It was a solemn, quiet scene." First vision. In 1844, Ellen White experienced her first vision. "At this time I visited one of our Advent sisters, and in the morning we bowed around the family altar. It was not an exciting occasion, and there were but 5 of us present, all females. While praying, the power of God came upon me as I never had felt it before, and I was wrapped up in a vision of God's glory, and seemed to be rising higher and higher from the earth, and was shown something of the travels of the Advent people to the holy city. In this vision the Advent people were traveling a high and dangerous path towards the city of New Jerusalem. The path was lit from behind by a bright, which an angel told me was the midnight cry. Some of the travelers grew weary and were encouraged by Jesus. Others denied the light. The light behind them went out, and they fell off the path into the dark and wicked world below. The vision continued with a portrayal of Christ's second coming, following which the Advent people entered the New Jerusalem, and ended with her returning to earth feeling lonely, desolate and longing for that better world. As Godfrey T. Anderson said, in effect, the vision assured the Advent believers of eventual triumph despite the immediate despair into which they had plunged. Second and third visions. In February 1845, White experienced her second vision in Exeter, Maine, known as the bridegroom vision, together with a third vision about the new earth. The visions gave continued meaning to the October 1844 experience and supported the developing sanctuary rationale. Additionally, they played an important role in countering the spiritualizing views of many fanatical Adventists by portraying the Father and Jesus as literal beings and heaven as a physical place. Public testimony. Fearing people would not accept her testimony, Ellen did not initially share her visions with the wider Millerite community. In a meeting at her parents' home when she received what she regarded as confirmation of her ministry, while praying, the thick darkness that had enveloped me was scattered. A bright light, like a ball of fire, came towards me, and as it fell upon me, my strength was taken away. I seemed to be in the presence of Jesus and the angels. Again it was repeated, "Make known to others what I have revealed to you." Soon Ellen was giving her testimony in public meetings, some of which she arranged herself, and in her regular Methodist class meetings in private homes. I arranged meetings with my young friends, some of whom were considerably older than myself, and a few were married persons. A number of them were vain and thoughtless. My experience sounded to them like an idle tale, and they did not heed my entreaties. But I determined that my efforts should never cease till these dear souls, for whom I had so great an interest, yielded to God. Several entire nights were spent by me in earnest prayer for those whom I had sought out and brought together for the purpose of laboring and praying with them. News of her visions spread, and White was soon traveling and speaking to groups of Millerite followers in Maine and the surrounding area. Her visions were not publicized further afield until January 24, 1846, when her account of the first vision, Letter from Sister Harmon, was published in the Day-Star, a Millerite paper published in Cincinnati, Ohio by Enoch Jacobs. White had written to Jacobs to encourage him, and although she stated the letter was not written for publication, Jacobs printed it anyway. Through the next few years it was republished in various forms and is included as part of her first book, Christian Experience and Views, published in 1851. Two Millerites claimed to have had visions prior to Ellen White: William Ellis Foy and Hazen Foss, Ellen White's brother-in-law. Adventists believe the prophetic gift offered to these two men was passed on to White when they rejected it. Middle life. Ellen White described the vision experience as involving a bright light which would surround her, and she felt herself in the presence of Jesus or angels who would show her events and places. The transcriptions of White's visions generally contained theology, prophecy, or personal counsels to individuals or to Adventist leaders. One of the best examples of her personal counsels is found in a 9-volume series of books entitled Testimonies for the Church, that contains edited testimonies published for the general edification of the Church. The spoken and written versions of her visions played a significant part in establishing and shaping the organizational structure of the emerging Adventist Church. Her visions and writings continue to be used by church leaders in developing the church's policies and for devotional reading. On March 14, 1858, at Lovett's Grove, near Bowling Green, Ohio, White received a vision while attending a funeral service. On the day, James White wrote that God manifested his power in a wonderful manner, adding that several had decided to keep the Lord's Sabbath and go with the people of God. Quote, in writing about the vision, she stated that she received practical instruction for church members, and more significantly, a cosmic sweep of the conflict between Christ and his angels, and Satan and his angels. Ellen White would expand upon this great controversy theme, which would eventually culminate in the Conflict of the Ages series. From 1861 to 1881, Ellen White's prophetic ministry became increasingly recognized among Sabbatarian Adventists. Her frequent articles in the Review and Herald and other church publications were a unifying influence to the beginning church. She supported her husband in the church's need for formal organization. The result was the organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1863. During the 1860s and 1870s, the Whites participated in the founding of the denomination's first medical institution and school. Her books on education and publishing have been influential on Christian education and publishing systems in the U.S., Europe, and Australia. Ellen White is the most translated American non-fiction author of all time, with 100,000 pages of manuscript, 40 books, with the book Steps to Christ being translated into more than 140 languages. Later ministry. After 1882, Ellen White was assisted by a close circle of friends and associates. She employed a number of literary assistants who would help her in preparing her writings for publications. She also carried on an extensive correspondence with church leaders. She traveled to Europe on her first international trip. Upon her return, she promoted the message of righteousness by faith presented by young ministers E.J. Waggoner and A.T. Jones, leading to a more Christ-centered theology for the church. When church leaders resisted her counsel on this and various other matters, she was sent to Australia as a missionary, though she lived first in Melbourne and later moved to Orlandobrunet, New South Wales, co-founding Avondale College. After almost 9 years, she returned to the U.S. Final years. When Ellen White returned to the U.S. in 1900, she thought her stay would be temporary, and she called for church reorganization at the pivotal 1901 General Conference session. During her later years, she wrote extensively for church publications and wrote her final books. During her final years, she would travel less frequently as she concentrated upon writing her last works for the church. In 1915, White tripped while entering her study room and broke her hip. Her health subsequently began to decline, and she died on July 16, 1915. After 3 funeral services, she was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery with her husband. Personality and public persona. White was a powerful and sought-after preacher. While she has been perceived as having a strict and serious personality, perhaps due to her lifestyle standards, numerous sources describe her as a friendly person. Major teachings. Theology: Christ-centered salvation by grace. The Great Controversy theme. Obedience to revealed truth, a sign of genuine faith. Jerry Moon argues that White taught assurance of salvation. Arthur Patrick believes that White was evangelical, in that she had high regard for the Bible, saw the cross as central, supported righteousness by faith, believed in Christian activism, and sought to restore New Testament Christianity. Education. Ellen White's earliest essays on education appeared in the 1872 autumn editions of the Health Reformer. In her first essay, she stated that working with youthful minds was the most delicate of tasks. The manner of instruction should be varied. This would make it possible for the higher noble powers of the mind to have a chance to develop. To be qualified to educate the youth, parents and teachers must have self-control, gentleness and love. Ellen White's idea of creating a Christian educational system and its importance in society is detailed in her writings Christian Education and Education. Health reform. Ellen White expounded greatly on the subject of health and nutrition, as well as healthy eating and a balanced diet. At her behest, the Seventh-day Adventist Church first established the Western Health Reform Institute in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1866 to care for the sick as well as to disseminate health instruction. Over the years, other Adventist sanitariums were established around the country. These sanitariums became hospitals, forming the backbone of the Adventists' medical network and, in 1972, forming the Adventist health system. The beginnings of this health ministry are found in a vision that White had in 1863. The vision was said to have occurred during a visit by James and Ellen White to Otsego, Michigan, to encourage the evangelistic workers there. As the group bowed in prayer at the beginning of Sabbath, Ellen White reportedly had a vision of the relation of physical health to spirituality, of the importance of following right principles in diet and in the care of the body, and of the benefits of nature's remedies: clean air, sunshine, exercise and pure water. Previous to this vision, little thought or time had been given to health matters in the church, and several of the overtaxed ministers had been forced to become inactive because of sickness. This revelation on June 6, 1863 impressed upon the leaders in the newly organized church the importance of health reform. In the months that followed, as the health message was seen to be a part of the message of Seventh-day Adventists, a health educational program was inaugurated. An introductory step in this effort was the publishing of 6 pamphlets of 64 pages each, entitled Health, or How to Live, compiled by James and Ellen White. An article from White was included in each of the pamphlets. The importance of health reform was greatly impressed upon the early leaders of the church through the untimely death of Henry White at the age of 16, the severe illness of Elder James White, which forced him to cease work for 3 years, and through the sufferings of several other ministers. Early in 1866, responding to the instruction given to Ellen White on Christmas Day in 1865 that Seventh-day Adventists should establish a health institute for the care of the sick and the imparting of health instruction, plans were laid for the Western Health Reform Institute, which opened in September 1866. While the Whites were in and out of Battle Creek from 1865 to 1868, James White's poor physical condition led them to move to a small farm near Greenville, Michigan. White's idea of health reform included vegetarianism in a day and age where meat and 2 vegetables was the standard meal for a typical North American. Her health message inspired a health food revolution, starting with John Harvey Kellogg in his creation of corn flakes. The Sanitarium Health Food Company, as it is now known, was also started by this health principle. Adhering to the principles outlined in the health reform, John Harvey Kellogg differed from his brother's views on the sugar content of the cornflake breakfast cereal. The latter started Kellogg Company. White championed a vegetarianism that was intended to be not only physically, but also spiritually helpful to humans, and also to treat God's creatures with love and respect. Her views are expressed in many of her writings, such as Important Facts of Faith, Laws of Health, and Testimonies, Nos. 1-10, Healthful Living, The Ministry of Healing, The Health Food Ministry, and Counsels on Diet and Foods. Major writings. Some of her most well-known books are Steps to Christ, a classic, concise treatment of personal devotional topics, Christ's Object Lessons, about the parables of Jesus, Education, Principles of Christian Education, The Ministry of Healing, Instructions on Healthy Living and the Care of Others, Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, about Christ's Sermon on the Mount. Conflict of the Ages book series, Patriarchs and Prophets, covering Genesis to the end of King David's reign, Prophets and Kings, covering King Solomon's reign to the last prophetic book of the Old Testament, The Desire of Ages, covering the life and ministry of Jesus, the Acts of the Apostles, describing the 12 apostles and the early Christian church, the great controversy about church history viewed in terms of the conflict between Christ and Satan. During her lifetime, Ellen White wrote more than 5,000 periodical articles, 40 books, and reported over 2,000 visions and dreams, most of which she was convinced were communications with supernatural entities, including various angels and sometimes Jesus. Today, over 100 titles are available in English, including compilations from her 50,000 manuscript pages. External book links are to the official Ellen White website. The Conflict of the Ages volumes are also available as e-books.